Hi everyone, so today in this screencast we're going to be talking about plankton. I'm going to start off by saying I haven't used this screencast app before, so I apologize if there are any weird things that go on, and also I apologize if you hear some weird noises, which would be my dogs playing in the background. When we're talking about plankton, there are two main sort of types that we're talking about. We have the phytoplankton, which are like the plants of the sea. And then we have zooplankton, which are those tiny little animals that we find near the surface in aquatic environments. So we've already talked about phytoplankton a lot, but in terms of zooplankton, so that's what we're going to focus on now, they usually are going to be pretty weak swimmers, and they're going to sort of just drift along with the currents. There are two main groups of plankton. We have the permanent members of the plankton, which are called holoplankton. And some examples of them are diatoms, radiolurans, the dinoflagellates that you've read about, amphipods, krill are parts of them as well. And then we also have our second group, which are going to be temporary members. So that would be like a larval form of a sea urchin, maybe a sea star, a marine worm, some of the marine snails, most fish. And those are called meroplankton. So both phytoplankton and zooplankton are really key components in marine ecosystems because they form the base of most of the marine food webs. Zooplankton are typically classified by their size or their developmental stage. So there are different size categories that we'll mention. Picoplankton are going to be less than 2 micrometers. Then we have nanoplankton, which will be between 2 and 20 micrometers. Then microplankton, which will be between 20 and 200 micrometers. Then mesoplankton, which will be between 0.2 and 20 millimeters. Macroplankton will be between 20 and 200 millimeters. And then megaplankton, which will measure over 200 millimeters. And just to give you a sense of size, 200 millimeters is almost 8 inches long. So as we said, there are two categories that we use to classify those zooplankton, which is based on their stage of development. So let's just refer back to that now. And so here we have our meroplankton and our holoplankton. The meroplankton are actually larvae that will eventually change into those worms, those crustaceans, mollusks, even coral, fishes, and insects. And then our holoplankton are going to remain plankton for their entire life cycle. And those include the pteropods, those sea butterflies that we saw in class, larvaceans, siphonophores, and copepods. Meroplankton and holoplankton are basically a component of almost every taxonic group, but the most common plankton are protists. Also nanoplanktonic flagellates. We also have rotifers, copepods, krills, things like that. Don't worry about writing all of those names down. We'll go into some more detail about them. So zooplankton also include these nanoplanktonic flagellates, and they're important because they help to keep bacteria populations under control. They tend to have a long tail that's used for swimming, which is called a flagellate. Or they'll have hair-like structures, which are called cilia. So here's an image for you. It's a little hard to see based on this picture here, but there is a flagellum, which is that tail that will help it to, in fact, swim. So some dinoflagellates are going to have a net-like structure as well, which is called a protoplasmic net. And they use this to capture and eat prey that are typically larger in size than most bacteria. Some of these dinoflagellate species are also responsible for harmful fish kills and also the, as you know, infamous red tides. So when I'm using the word dinoflagellate, that just means that it does have that tail that they use for swimming. And then when I say something is a ciliate, that means that it has cilia, those hair-like structures. And so ciliates are actually capable of catching bacteria using those hairs. They can also catch other protists or phytoplankton. And while we're talking about sort of capturing other organisms, there's another type of organisms called mixotrophs. And they're pretty neat because they're sort of half plant and half animal. And they have the ability to eat other organisms through a process called phagocytosis. Phago means to eat, cytosis means cells, so it's the process of engulfing other cells for ingestion. But they also contain structures that are necessary for photosynthesis. Here's an example of a common mixotroph, which is called the euglena. Next, I want to talk about krill, which are found all over the world. They can be 3 centimeters large, which is pretty big in comparison to other zooplankton, but they're a very important food source for a lot of organisms, in particular whales. In cold water, krill will feed on diatoms, which, as you know, is a type of phytoplankton, but in warmer water, they tend to prefer to eat other animals. You guys all probably know what krill look like, but interestingly, krill means whale food in Norwegian. You can sort of divide those crustaceans into 2 families, but I won't get into too much detail except that you can have a deep water krill, and you can also, that is not bioluminescent. And then the other krill species are the most frequent species that are associated with krill, and they do have bioluminescent abilities. So those are just 2 examples for you guys of different types of plankton. The krill that we're talking about there, and then flagellates here, just 2 different types of plankton. There are many. But all species of plankton have sort of been forced to develop certain structural adaptations that help them float in the water column. So they could have lateral spines, they could have a flat body, maybe they produce oil droplets, they may float, create a float that's sort of filled with gas, or they may have the ability to sort of replace ions. Having a flat body and having spines will allow some of the species of plankton to resist sinking, and it does this by increasing the surface area of their bodies, but it also keeps the volume small. And then all of those other adaptations that I mentioned keep plankton from sinking quickly to the bottom. Zooplankton, in addition, have also adapted other mechanisms to help deter fish. And fish are their heaviest predator. So that could mean that they have a transparent body, so the fish can't see them. They could, in fact, have bright colors. They could taste really bad. They could also have a red coloring when they get to deeper water. And they also could have something called cyclomorphosis. And this is something that happens when predators will release a chemical into the water that will signal zooplankton, like let's say a rotifer, to increase their spines and actually act as and increase also their protective shields. And then the last thing I want to talk about is how these plankton will differ sort of in their habits in the day versus in the nighttime. So many different types of zooplankton will actually migrate deeper into the water during the day, but then they'll come up at night, which is something you guys probably have experienced before when you've maybe swam in a bioluminescent body of water, and you're noticing that you see all of those plankton when you move the water around. But the migration of those species looks like it's probably dependent on location rather than a particular species type. And all plankton sort of migrate differently based on factors like their age or the season or their sex. And the amount of light is probably, though, the major factor in this sort of migratory behavior. It seems like most zooplankton move around most in low light and least in the higher light situation. So it's possible that zooplankton migrate to lower levels during the day so they're less visible to predators that rely on vision. But then at night, zooplankton can sneak up to the surface and they can snack on phytoplankton, and it's relatively safe. Also, the lower metabolism that occurs in colder waters during the day could be a factor in the migration of these zooplankton, and in this way, they can save energy by feeding in the cooler night waters. So to summarize, plankton are incredibly important, and basically life in the ocean wouldn't be able to exist without them. They're really necessary in the early life stages of almost every species of marine animal. They also are food sources for a lot of different sessile, which means non-moving marine organisms. They also will trap greenhouse gases and can prevent them from being released into the atmosphere. And interestingly, some scientists have even proposed that we should seed the ocean with nutrients to help encourage these phytoplankton produce and sort of help to offset that climate change. And in total, they produce more of the Earth's oxygen than all land plants combined. And an interesting fact for you there to end with, like the word planet, plankton comes from a Greek word planktos, which means wanderer.